Hi folks, and welcome to this, the third Motorcycle Enquiries special. Thank you for all those people who've been in touch requesting it. I've been really surprised by how popular it's been, but hey, it's really nice. Anyway, I'm going to talk today a bit about motorcycle culture, and we're going to go through how the different cultures in different countries have developed, and also how that then reflects on the motorcycle culture in this country today, and a little bit on some of the etiquette that you may need to bear in mind if you're going to be getting into motorcycling. So, in terms of culture, there are different cultures across the world and within groups within this country as well. And these different cultures have come about through different reasons. So, the culture that I know a lot of people immediately associate with the term biker is the American context. The idea of big choppers, black leather, that kind of bad image. And that really comes from the fact that the US didn't really have motorcycles until after the Second World War. And there's many reasons for this, but the US has always really been based on cars. They had car production, they had roads that were designed for cars in a and it also came about relatively quickly around the start of the 20th century. So cars were the normal thing. There were motorcycles, but they were very much niche. So Americans go off to fight in Europe, and while they're out there, they are exposed to motorcycles, and they use them in the war effort because that's what's provided. And they sort of gain an affinity for these machines. But also, that's how Harley-Davidson got their foot in the market, because they provided a load of machines for the American war effort. Anyway, war finishes, and these motorcycles come back with the soldiers, and the soldiers who'd got this sort of feeling of camaraderie and brotherhood thought, well, they want to carry that on. And so a lot of them bought these old War Department motorcycles and formed this sort of this brotherhood and these groups based on their shared experiences. Very tight-knit community. Often they felt like outsiders. A lot of soldiers had PTSD, didn't feel like they could relate to civilian life, so they became kind of outsiders, and that's where the idea of the outlaw motorcycle club really started to come from. This idea of social outsiders, motorcyclists on the edge of society, and the sort of the car driving decent folk who were suspicious and often quite hostile towards motorcyclists. So that kind of us and them mentality developed, and it's still kind of there in the States now, and that's why you get a lot of big bike gangs in the States. Or one of the reasons, anyway. Now, in America, they will often identify the difference between a motorcycle and a motorbike. It doesn't matter so much in this country. I tend to use that kind of distinction, but that's just sort of a quirk. But for them, a motorcycle is something like this. It's a big, traditional machine, whereas a motorbike is something smaller, more like a little Japanese bike. And they tend to use that distinction. Now, the Japanese context is quite interesting because after the Second World War, the Japanese economy was in tatters, and so they were rebuilding, reindustrializing, and one of the things that they started to create was motorcycles, because they were quite easy to create, quite profitable, exported well, and could be sold quite cheaply, and people would buy them in bulk. And certainly Soichiro Honda was very keen to create motorcycles that could also help get the Japanese population up and running again. In fact, the Honda Super Cub, which they just used to be everywhere in the 70s and onwards, was designed in such a way that you didn't have to use both hands on handlebars to change gear, so that you could hold a package while you were riding. Generally like a box of noodles, I think, was the original idea. Anyway, so the Japanese context was one of practicality. They wanted to create practical machines for an export market. So they're often clean, reliable, efficient. So Japanese motorcycling started off really as being like just a good, practical way of transport. Now there are motorcycle subcultures in Japan, and sort of motorcycle gangs, and I won't go into them here, but they are fascinating. They're worth researching if you're interested in Japanese culture. But Japanese motorbikes started showing up in the States, and also started showing up in the UK. And this affected the culture to a degree. But certainly in the States, it stayed very much as a more niche thing. Like particularly if you had a motorcycle, that was a real cultural statement. Few people had motorbikes, but most people stuck with cars. Now the context in the UK, very, very different. Europe in general, different, and I suspect that what I'm going to say about the UK applies to quite a lot of European countries as well. You do still see a lot more motorbikes, scooters around in Europe than you do in the UK, but I couldn't speak with any authority. But anyway, in the UK, motorcycles were the main form of transport and have been for a long time. The thing is, it comes down, as is so often, to cash and class. Now, cars were expensive, and Brits didn't generally earn that much in the early 20th century. Cars, in fact, were very expensive because they were the preserve of the rich. They were the playthings for the rich and the aristocratic, and you know what? They wanted to keep it that way. As far as they were concerned, they were quite happy keeping the cars in the upper classes and out of the hands of the people of the hoi polloi. Compare that to the American context, where they believe that if something's good, everyone should have it. I mean, you can criticise the Americans for whatever you like, but in terms of providing goods for people, particularly in the 20th century, they really did get behind that idea of democratising products. Not so in the UK. But people needed transport. And what was affordable? What was available? Motorcycles, generally. People would be able to go to their local blacksmith, which often turned into a sort of cottage mechanic, and even have engines fitted to their bicycles to create little motorcycles that they could ride around on. And so it became a very common thing in Britain for transport to be on two wheels. Goods were transported on trailers or in sidecars, and it was easy to maintain these things at home as well. You could do your own work on them, parts were cheap, they were relatively easy, and companies like BSA and Royal Enfield were originally arms manufacturers. They made guns, but actually the machinery involved in making guns and making small engines and motorcycles is quite similar. So there were lots of factors that led to people generally buying these things. Also roads, bad roads, industrialisation had happened in the cities, but rural areas were still pretty much barely paved in the early 20th century. Streets were narrow in towns. Motorcycles made sense. And so Brits fell in love with them. And if there's one thing that Brits are very good at as well, it is competing around something. You know, a new invention is created, and the first thing that you'll get is people trying to compete with them, and the second thing is you get an owners' club. You know, that's just how it works. And so there were owners' clubs, competitions, people loved them to race them and compete with them, because they were, you know, cheap, good fun. So this culture of motorcycling was not so much a kind of an outsider thing, it was a everyday thing. People just did it. That sort of changed in the 80s. There was a big push for the car economy. People, it started to change in the 60s. People wanted cars. The M1 being opened in 1959 made car transport more easy. But it was really 80s where it became less common for people to have bikes. And cheap cars became available to younger drivers as well, because it used to be that if you were a kid, you'd get a bike because that was all you could afford. And you know, you'd go to the factory or the mine or whatever on your bike. But that all changed, and so since the 80s it's become less and less common for people to have motorcycles, and what used to be a real sort of popular, as in for the population, people's bikes, have now become much more niche. And although you do get outlaw motorcycle clubs in this country, it tends to be more of sort of a family thing. It's almost like a dynasty, that someone will introduce you to motorcycles and then you pass it on to your kids, and often you get motorcycling families, and families who have never touched two wheels. So the British culture is not one so much of us versus them, outsiders, rebels, that kind of thing. It's more based on enthusiasm and sort of a very deeply rooted, if sometimes overgrown, culture. So how does this apply now? Well, you've essentially got this culture of, this history of racing, kind of tradition, and enthusiasm. So the racing context is still there, and the sports context. That's good timing. Sports bikes are very popular, and people like fast bikes in this country. So you'll often get kind of sports circuit, people who want competition, who want fast bikes, and who all come together. So if you like fast bikes, and if you like sports, there are track events, there are clubs, there are all kinds of people. So there are big, inclusive clubs that go with it. However, there is also a traditional element to it. And this sometimes gives the impression of it being kind of an exclusive club. It often means that people who know motorcycles have grown up with them. They've always been around, they know all the words, they know how to maintain them, they may have been riding them since they were kids, and that can make it quite intimidating for the uninitiated. You know, it's like walking into a room and you don't understand any of the language. It's not as obviously open. Small groups, you're always going to get people like that. But actually, certainly in my experience, this is very much less common than the other side, which links to the idea of enthusiasm. Yes, there is like a sort of a heraldry to this now, but there is also still a huge enthusiasm. Motorcyclists are still enthusiasts. And even if they are the sort of person who will count rivets and make sure that all the nuts and bolts are authentic, they'll always be happy to talk bikes, they'll always be happy to encourage other people. In the end, that enthusiasm is still there, and it's still that kind of, well, this is something that everyone should enjoy. And you do see that. You do see a generally positive kind of attitude towards newcomers. And although it can be quite intimidating, the vast majority of motorcyclists are open and welcoming. And they would rather this fine tradition, as they see it, carries on, rather than dying out. So the nice thing about this kind of enthusiastic and inclusive environment, even if it seems a bit exclusive, it is inclusive, is that you can just do things your own way. You can have whatever type of machine you want, and you can either join a club, or you can do it your own way. You can ride with your friends, or you can ride alone. I mean, for me, I'm a lone rider. I don't tend to ride with anyone else. It's like a couple of exceptions, and you have to be very special to get a ride on the back, quite frankly. But you know, that is as acceptable as people who go out riding with their clubs or with their friends, and that's all fine. Now you do have to bear some things in mind. So regardless of your riding, you're expected to be polite. You're expected to give a little wave or a nod to other motorcyclists. So as you're riding along, just there's a sort of biker nod. It's kind of a 45-degree tip. And that's you saying hi. So you don't have to take your hands off the bars. If you don't get a nod back, don't take it personally. Often they're thinking about something else or just trying to concentrate. Also, if you do join a club or an association of any kind, you are expected to commit to it. You know, these people want to include you, but you have to actually give something in return. At the very least, your time. And you have to decide, are you going to ride in a group? And if you are going to ride in a group, you have to be very careful not to let the group riding put you at risk. I'll talk about more of that when we get onto like the safe riding video, but group riding can lead you to ride in a way that's not safe. So just be aware of that and think about who you ride with. There is one very serious point I want to make about motorcycle culture though, and that's about patches. You may see motorcyclists with patches on their back. It's that classic biker look, right? A back patch. You may not know, but the patches actually have got a lot of meaning. And the style of the patches has meaning as well. Now you can decorate your jacket however you like, but just be aware of this, because your ignorance could get you into trouble otherwise. A single patch on the back is unlikely to get too much attention unless you're at a motorcycle rally. It suggests you're part of a club if you've got any kind of patch on your back, but a single patch, just one big, say, circle or square, you might get a bit of hassle, but nothing too bad, probably. If you've got writing on that single patch, a bit more sketchy. But if you have a patch in the middle, which is an image, and then text over the top, text underneath, you're asking for trouble. That kind of patch layout is used by motorcycle clubs and gangs which are territorial and for which it's difficult to join. So if you want to join, you earn those patches. You only get given the patches when it's been decided that you are worthy of joining. So why is it an issue if you decorate your jacket in a particular way? Well, if you stick patches on your back in that kind of layout, it makes it look like either you're part of a motorcycle club that may or may not exist, or if those images look too similar to another club, it looks like you're trying to mimic it. Either way, it's a sign of great disrespect, particularly for those people who've worked so hard to join the club and they don't like it. Particularly prospect members, so members of clubs who are trying to prove themselves, they may well seek retaliation on people who they see to be disrespectful, and they'll be looking to try and prove themselves. So my advice, just don't do it. Don't put patches on your back. And certainly don't go for like that kind of one in the middle and then two over the top and the bottom. For heaven's sake, don't wear Sons of Anarchy stuff either. Again, it's disrespectful. Most motorcyclists are fine, but you do not want to be disrespecting these people. It's not as bad as it is in the States, in the US, but please believe me when I say that it can be a matter of life and death, and don't ask me why I know that. So do what you want with your jacket. Do what you want with your clothing. Hey, if you want to put a logo on the back, spray paint it on, or just paint it on, maybe even just stitch some patterns in, but just don't make it look like a gang or club patch. If you're really unsure, do a bit of research into which clubs and gangs are in the area. Make sure that you're not doing anything that could annoy them. And if you really want to, you could always get in touch and say, hey, I painted up my jacket like this. Are you cool with me wearing it while I ride? They may say yes. But, you're free to do what you like. But for what it's worth, I just wouldn't. If in doubt, don't do it. So, once again, thanks for watching. Keep those comments and questions coming. It's always great to have them. But otherwise, thanks for watching and see you next time.